call the meeting of the Audit Committee for Sioux Falls City Council to order at 4 p.m. on Thursday, the 11th of
16th.
December.
Of December. Isn't it the 11th or 12th?
It's
13th.
11th.
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 11th. Christine is trying to mix me up again.
Don't look at her.
Oh, man. We need an audit. Yeah, we need an audit of that. Oh, it says right here, right at the top of your agenda, Christine. And I will announce right now that we are not on TV and we are not on Sire. So, you know, that's the way it is, although it's a Reddit deal is up there. Let's continue with minutes, updating meeting held in October. We have the minutes of those. Could I hear a motion to approve the minutes? And second, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Thank you, Tamara, for having those. We have some reports and updates going on today. Let's first hear from Dean Bucknenberg with Ide Bailey on our external audit of the city's financial situation.
Thank you, Rex. Well, good afternoon. I'm Dean Bucknenberg. I'm partner with Ide Bailey. For those of you that haven't met me, I see a couple of new faces. I am involved with the city's audit sort of as a overall communications partner. And can we get Brian Stavanger on the phone as well? And I have with me Miranda Gallagher, who's involved real directly with the financial statement audit. We are beginning the process of a financial audit as well as a compliance audit with regard to the federal funding that the city receives every year. So we're required to not only report on the financial statements, but to express an opinion on compliance with all of the federal regulations and the rules relative.
This is Brian.
Hi, Brian. This is Tamara, the Assistant City Clerk for the Audit Committee. Welcome to the meeting. Can you hear us okay?
I can, thank you.
Okay, we can hear you very clear. So, Mr. Bucknenberg
Good.
is speaking.
Hi, Brian. We're just sort of introducing the process a little bit.
Okay.
Introduced Miranda and other members. Of course, Brian is the engagement partner responsible for the actual audit engagement, and then Jamie Fay from Fargo is directly involved with the A133 compliance audit, as well as various other staff members from our Sioux Falls office here. Some of that work is going to be starting this next week, and will continue in January. Brian has put together this PowerPoint demonstration or presentation. Brian, would you like to take us through this?
I sure can, yeah.
Dean and Brian, before you do, could we get the hard copies just in case you want to make notes?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, we have hard copies of this as well, and so I'm sure you'll all want to take notes as we go through it. We have 10 slides, and so it's meant to give you kind of an overview of the process, what we're looking at, sort of what our plan is. But as part of this, we'd like to get feedback or questions from all of you with regard to any concerns that you would like to have us address as part of the external audit process. And we'll be in communication and coordination with the internal audit staff as well as we work through this. So Brian, they all have the hard copies now, and we've got the PowerPoint on the screen as well, if you want to start us through.
Okay, thank you, Dean. Thanks for having me participate via phone call. I appreciate it. So the table of contents lists really the 4 different areas, and Dean already talked about the service team, so we'll move on to the audit objectives. And these really haven't changed from last year and really most recent years. We perform an audit following generally accepted auditing standards. Because you are a local government entity, we're required to follow government auditing standards. So it's really just another more stringent level of standards. And also because of the federal expenditures that you have, and because you have excess of $500,000, which you have significant in excess of that, and that happens every year, you also require an OMB Circular A133 audit, which is really just a compliance-specific audit to those federal awards and federal expenditures. So those are the different standards that we will follow. Our audit is done to obtain reasonable and not absolute assurance about whether the financial statements are free of material misstatement. So sometimes there's some misconceptions out there that we are going through, line by line, penny by penny, making sure everything's there, and that's not the case. We do it on a sample basis, and so we obtain reasonable, but not that absolute assurance. So what our procedures will do is we will examine on a test basis, so that's kind of the sampling that I talked about, evidence that support amounts and disclosures within your financial statements. To do that, we'll also have discussions with management. Part of the process is we have discussions with management, and then we kind of hear their story and their support of those items and those amounts, and then we also obtain supporting documentation in excess of that, so really trying to corroborate that evidence. We assess the quality of the accounting principles and significant estimates, and with the city's audit, we've identified 3 significant estimates that we spend more time than other estimates auditing. So those would be the incurred but not reported insurance claims, the IBNR, the other post-employment benefits, referred to as OPEB, and then the sanitary landfill closure and post-closure costs. So with that, we design specific tests to really ensure that those estimates are as accurate as they can be this year. Part of what we do is we kind of do a look back. We'll look back at previous 1 to 5 years worth of estimates and kind of see what the actual was. So, really a test of how good are those estimates when you compare them to the actual results. The next page or next slide, and it's really made up of 2 slides, is the audit approach, really our audit plan. So as Dean mentioned, we'll actually do some work next week, but we've already been spending some time planning the audit. We do that really starting in November, and this year actually we started a little bit early because of the implementation of the new accounting system by the city. That required us to do some work, and we were able to get some of that done even this summer. But what we'll do during the planning stages, and what we've started and will continue to do this month, we look at any changes to the entity or the environment. So a lot of this has to do with discussion with management. Look at any internal control changes. We work with internal audit, see what they've done throughout the year, see what items they've found or they've discovered, and then we incorporate that into our planning for our audit. We do our fraud inquiries, so we'll talk to certain audit committee members, we'll talk to council members, we'll talk to management, we talk to internal audit, and then we also talk to various other staff throughout the city who aren't in those management positions, and we really get a wide variety of people that we talk to concerning fraud risks, things that they may have seen throughout the year. And then any new accounting changes, which really, besides the software, not really any new accounting standards that are going to be implemented this year. We'll talk a little bit about what's going to be in the near future, but nothing really this year that will impact the financial statements. Getting into really next week is when we start our interim testing, and we continue that in January. You can see all those different things we do, confirming expectations of field work and ultimately the finalization of the audit. We go through our fraud and risk assessment. We look at internal control, so any changes to that, and then we'll start testing that internal control. Any new and significant transactions, and then we'll start obtaining data and making sample selections for year-end and scope determination. So those are some of the items that are done in December and January. As you go on to the next slide, year-end testing in January, February, and March. We take a risk-based approach, which we'll look at that. That's on the last couple of slides. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. We test account balances, test unique transactions, review and test those estimates and assumptions. Getting back to that A133 audit, working on all of those federal expenditures. Review the work and the financial statements. We generally try to get everything issued by the end of March, and then we report back to you in April. Questions or comments on that audit approach?
Not seeing any, Brian.
Okay, the next page, new accounting changes. As I mentioned, there's really nothing that's going to impact the 12/31/14 audit, but something to be aware of for next year. There's two fiscal year 15. There's going to be two new accounting changes. One is what's called GASB 68, and that has to do with the reporting for pension liabilities. And what's going to happen? I think we've talked about this before, but we just want to continue to talk about it because it is going to be a change. On one of the financial statements that the city has in the CAFR, there will now be, again, in 15, there'll be a net pension liability that will be reported. So previously, this pension liability was contained in the supplemental information. So we'll, a guess of mine is probably page 75 of the CAFR. So it's way back there. It's something if you're not reading through the entire thing or looking specifically for it, you're not going to see it. Well, that's now going to be placed right on the statement of net position as a liability. And it's also going to expand the required disclosure. So there'll be much more disclosure on what that liability is and what it means. Something very, very important that I always like to say is this does not require a funding of the liability. So there is a liability that exists, but the standard does not say you have to fully fund it. It doesn't even recommend how you fund it. It just says you have to report the liability and disclose what it means. So the portion of the pension liability for the city, generally that, we're still, I think, working through that, the fine details of that. But essentially that's going to come from the state. And so the impact on the city and the audit process, we're not completely sure what it's going to be, but we do have a good understanding that the state's going to provide a lot of that information. So it should be, it shouldn't have an enormous impact on the audit process. The end result, though, there will be a liability on there that's never been there, and we'll certainly have a lot of discussion on that.
And there's really, Brian.
The other one is the super. Oh,
Brian, I'm sorry. There's really two plans that are in effect. The new employees are gone on the state plan, and so we'd get that portion from them, and then we'll have to deal with the other plan as well. Pull those together, but not till next year as far as the liability goes. Sorry, Brian.
So the super circular is the other big change, and that, as is stated there on the slide, it's a sweeping reform of federal grant operations. So it really impacts the city because from an administrative standpoint for grant applications, grant reporting, all of those things are changing. And then from an audit standpoint, the A133 that I've talked about a couple of times, that's going to change. And what's going to change is what we have to look at. So there's going to be a much more of a focus on, from an auditor standpoint, federal government is asking us to look a lot more at fraud, waste, and abuse. And we are still waiting on guidance as to what exactly we are supposed to do with that. And really what it comes down to is how do I say we think that is wasteful spending, or I think that's wasteful spending? That's really my opinion, and someone else could have a different opinion on what the definition of wasteful spending is. So, as auditors, we're concerned about what all of this means, and we're really waiting on guidance on
I can make it simple for you, Brian. Just go to the, if you think it's wasteful or anything close, just go to the chairman of the audit committee and run it by him.
There we go. This is great. appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's going to be a lot of changes. I think it's going to be a lot more administrative, and staff there are very well aware of it, and there's been a lot of communication already. Audit impact, we're still waiting on what that's all going to mean. But those are two items that will be, like I said, in effect 12/31/15, or really 1/1/15 for the super circular. So we'll get more into that, and we'll maintain communications with both the audit committee and management to make sure everything's on track there. So the last 3 slides are on risk assessment, and this is just really giving you a little preview into how we approach our audit. And we approach it by audit area, and you'll see that in a few slides. For example, cash, revenues, and receivables. So for each audit area, we look at the inherent risk and the fraud risk. And so the definition of those risks are on the 8th slide. I don't know if we have slide numbers there, but you've got the definition there, and I'm not going to go through these in detail, but this just gives you a little idea of where we've assessed the risk on these different areas. And essentially the higher risk areas are where we're going to spend a little bit more of our time. Revenues and receivables, payroll is where we spend a lot of time. Grants inherently provide or have some risk because of all the compliance issues that come along with those, and the A133 audit does cover a lot of that, so we spend a lot of time there. Journal entries is where we spend a lot of time, mainly due to the risk of override. There's a risk that when fraud occurs, it can be covered up through journal entries, making modifications to where certain items are coded to certain accounts, so we spend a lot of time understanding the journal entry process, the controls over that process, and then test that. So that's what's contained on the last few pages of that. And that's really a summary of our proposed audit approach for 2014. So really open it up to any other questions or comments that you may have.
Are there any questions or comments by the committee? Mr. Karski.
While we're on here, I'm just curious, based on what I do, when you talk about your audit objectives, you have 2 areas where it requires significant estimates. One's the IBNR and the other is the post-employment benefits. Are those calculated as percentages of the money being spent? How, just as a matter of practice, how are those calculated? And is there a norm in the industry for that type of thing? Where do we sit on that?
Did you want me to answer that?
Yeah, Brian, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, okay. So IBNR, and actually both of those estimates utilize the third parties to help with those estimates, but IBNR is really, at the end of the year, there are certain claims that have been incurred, but they just don't get reported until subsequent to year end. And typically that run out is about 3 months. So you can take a look at the activity that you've had for the year, and in general you can take that, multiply that down to what are you incurring each month, and take 3 months worth of that, and that's basically your IBNR. But we do get help from outside parties to look at 5-year estimates of that IBNR, because maybe it's, instead of 3 months, it's for this specific instance it's 2.5 months. But there are definite industry standards that are followed in that IBNR calculation to determine what it should be. When it comes to the OPEB, it's a little bit similar. It's a different type of calculation because there are actuarial assumptions that are made, based on investment return, retirements that may occur. But again, using an actuarial firm to assist with those calculations, and that's really what we rely on for that OPEB, for those OPEB amounts. And going back to that, you know, those actuaries definitely do use industry standards, but also then modify it if there's anything specific to the city that would impact or modify those standards.
So when you audit these, you're auditing them against the industry, what we do against the industry, is that what you're saying?
We generally take a look at, you know, what is the industry, but also what is the historical for Sioux Falls, and then just kind of compare the two, because they certainly can be different, but in general they're fairly typical with what the industry practice is and industry standards.
Okay.
Just for my information, if I can interrupt, would you give us an explanation or something that would define what an IBNR is? You know, incurred but not reported insurance claim. I break my arm, but I don't report it? Is that what you mean, or?
No, you slip and fall and you didn't report
So
it.
you break your arm, you go visit the doctor on December 28th, and then you don't get the bill until March 28th. No, that's a little, but you know, you don't get the bill until January 15th because of that whole billing process. It's really the timing of the billing done by the health industry, we'll call it.
Or workman's comp or anything along those lines?
Yeah,
Okay.
it really comes down to the timing of.
It's not that
of
they're
when
not
everything
being
is
reported. It's not that they're not being reported in that fiscal year.
It's delayed.
Delayed. Okay, thank you. That explains a little bit. You have any other questions? Christine? Arnie? I have a few. On your audit approach, under planning, my question that came up, will you be looking at the effectiveness and efficiency of the new accounting system that has been implemented in the finance department and other areas?
We certainly will be incorporating that into our test. We're going to be taking a good look at the function of the new accounting system, because it's not something that we've tested in prior audits, of course.
Okay.
So that will be a focus.
Good. I hope it makes it easier for everyone. That was the goal. So let us know if that is the situation. End of March then, so our meeting in April, we can expect a report back. Just to kind of get that on record for you, Dean.
Yes.
The net pension liability, I think that's going to be a good thing to have there, and I'll be very interested to look at that and see how we have done, because I think we do an audit almost every year, an actuarial audit of that, so that we stay at very close or above 100% on that. So hopefully we're going to come in very well on that, and I think that's a good thing. It's going to make a difference to a lot of other communities around the world and the United States. I know that's going to be a huge liability on our books. But Mr. Karski.
And I was kind of curious when the comment came up on that on the state, because we are now part of the South Dakota retirement system. Our liability is clearly defined under that system, where under the old system it was pretty wide open. So I mean, you said that we do account for that, but I mean, that has to be a relatively simple process. Is that right?
Well, I don't know if I'd call it simple, but you know, my understanding is you have two plans in place.
Correct.
And so it'll be
Have to do the internal audit, or not internal audit, but the actuarial audit, I think on an annual basis of the previous pension plan, to make sure we have enough projected ahead to cover the costs.
Adequately funded, yeah.
Yeah, adequately funded.
Well, and the vast majority are still on that plan,
Yes.
I would say.
Oh,
Yeah.
The
exactly.
vast majority right now, but at this point, but it'll gradually, slowly change.
I've been handed a note that we are live on TV now, so Christine, will you watch what you're doing? Sweeping reforms, fraud, waste, abuse, I talked about that. I think there was one other note I had. I noticed on here, on the risk assessment, the areas that you're going to look at, or that are there, can you give us an area? You know, all of these are low or moderate risk. Where in the city do we have high risk on either inherent risk or fraud? Is that a fair question?
Yeah. Well, when we go through our assessment based on everything that we've seen, we don't feel there's a high risk in any one of these areas, which is a good thing. And there's a lot of entities that we don't consider to have a high risk in a lot of areas where, more of our focus is going to be where that moderate risk is. And a lot of it has to do with the controls that you have in place, the level and experience and education and quality of staff, and that's where we feel to get to that high risk. Generally, that's going to be a smaller entity that maybe has one person, and there's just all kinds of risk because it's one person, and just because you have things spread out so adequately, we haven't identified anything as having that highest level of risk.
So this is more of a assigned risk by you from
Yes.
previous audits and that kind of thing, not that the revenues and receivables is inherently a low risk for all cities of any size.
Right.
They might be a high risk in whatever, some city somewhere in South Dakota or wherever in the United States.
These judgments are based on our planning and could change if we get into this and find out something, we definitely would change our risk assessments. But again, those are based on, what we're saying is for most of those areas, you have very, decent procedures. And so there's just not a high risk of material misstatement.
And that's a good thing.
Even without the, overall internal controls, the double checks.
And that's a good thing, like I said, for the city of Sioux Falls. Good. Any other questions or comments? Will you be back midway through this to give us a report on how things go, or is it waiting out to the end?
Well, what I would say, Mr. Chairman, and you alluded to it earlier, if things come up, we'll be in communication if there's any significant findings or issues. And we would hope that there would be a two-way street, that if anybody does come across some concerns or something that's relevant, please contact us as well. Otherwise, I think that if everything goes as planned, you won't hear from us until the end of March.
Okay. Super. Well, Brian and Dean, thank you very much, and Miranda, thank you very much for your report, and we'll look forward to seeing you 2nd of April or something like that.
Okay. You let us know, as long as it's not a Sunday.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to a review of the 2015 audit. I'm still in 1900s. 2015 audit plan, geez.
Yeah, I'm going to just show you something on the computer. It'll be up on the overhead there, and then we'll get into the actual,
Okay,
the plan, the hard copy you have there. So. This is something recommended when we did the peer review in October. They wanted to see some sort of risk assessment using, one way of doing it is with a point system, using a survey, for example, of directors, and using our judgment and coming up with some sort of systematic risk approach. They talked about using the red and yellow, green. And so what we did is I prepared a survey, and I sent it out to all the directors. The risk factors are there on the right there of the spreadsheet. I think we had maybe at least a dozen, if not more, different risk factors. We're asking the directors to evaluate their particular MOU, major organizational unit, as far as low, medium, or high. And degree of change, management turnover, how much cash do you process, complexity of operations, impact on public health and safety, et cetera, et cetera. So we got that information back, and then we started tabulating the points. And not a surprise to anybody, Public Works comes up number one, just because of the sheer volume of expenditures, the amount of staff they have, the impact on public health and safety, interest of media, elected officials, the public, they rise to the top of the list. Police also very high just because of their impact on public health and safety, and it's a very large department. And health was up there, and then affordable housing. And then kind of the medium category there you can see, and then the ones at the bottom. And so the idea is that you want to make sure your audit coverage is certainly hitting those red areas on a regular basis. And some of those green areas, you may not get around to it, or maybe once every 5 or 6 years, or you may never get around to it. But I'll show you another matrix I came up with. It just kind of shows the audit coverage. And as you can see, Public Works gets hit at least sometimes twice a year with various different audits. And there's a few departments that haven't got audited or not very often, but we look at this and just make sure that we're maybe not over auditing, maybe not under auditing. And we also include the major processes too. I'll just scroll down there for a second. Now, down at the bottom there, we have major business processes. These are things that cover more than one department, such as payroll, accounts payable, the capital program, and purchasing and procurement. And we try to get some coverage of there, too, on a regular basis. Okay, so that's from 2008 through this year. So it's about 7 years worth of coverage. Now we'll get into the annual audit plan, and we'll kind of go through that step by step. So you should have a hard copy in front of you. And when we did that survey, we also did request input from management. Is there anything you want audited? And also, is there anything you want a consultation about? Because we're allowed to do consultations under audit standards and also under our internal audit charter. And so first of all, we'll start out with the, on page 2 there at the top, revenue audits. Revenue audits we conduct to determine whether fees or other types of revenue are properly assessed, collected, and remitted. We focus on the ones that we assess as a city, but they're not audited or collected by the state. For example, sales tax is collected by the State Department of Revenue. They have Department of Revenue auditors, and so we let the state handle that. We get the remits every month from here. Property taxes come from Lincoln County and Minnehaha County. They're also audited by the state. So we try to focus on the ones that we assess, that nobody else audits. And for example, the cable television franchise fee, we've done that audit. I think it was about 5 years ago. I think 2010 maybe we did that. We have a new agreement in place that brings in about $750,000 annually to the city, and nobody else audits that. The public facility ticket fee, that's assessed on public facilities of 1,900 seats or larger. So the pavilion is not included, but the Sioux Falls Stadium, arena, event center, convention center, they all collect the fee. It's based on the face value of the ticket. I think it's 25 cents a ticket. Then if it gets up to it's a sliding scale, 25 cents going up, depending on the face value of the ticket. Another thing, nobody audits that, only we do, and so we put that on the audit plan, and that brings in about $275,000 a year. Next, other audits, accounts payable. Last time we did this was 2008. It's probably time to do that, especially with the change in the accounting system with the munis, looking at internal controls again. A key risk is making sure the master vendor file is maintained. That's how you enter. That's how you, if somebody wants to do business with the city, they have to go into this master vendor file, and that's certainly definitely a fraud risk. You want to have very tight controls on that, and we'll look at, of course, making sure we're not making duplicate payments. and that sort of thing. Police Crime Lab, that was requested by the police chief, Doug Bartell. In the Police Crime Lab, they have evidence such as drugs and cash. They want to make sure that's properly accounted for. He requested internal audit take a look at that. They do have an internal affairs group that does some checking on that, but he requested us to also look at that. So we put that on the plan. Bottom of page 2, information technology. The peer review back in October, they highly recommended we put that on the plan. It's part of the audit standards to look at information technology risks from time to time, so we put that on the plan. We understand from management that they have a consultant right now that is doing some, I believe, intrusion testing, something that we're not capable of doing. So when that is completed, we'll meet with management and we'll have some sort of report for the audit committee. Obviously, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on that for security reasons, but just to give you an overview what the consultant did for the city. And then next year we'll do basically the general controls, the things that we're qualified to look at. So top of page 3, affordable housing. Again, they administer numerous federal and state grants. There's a risk to that. There's a lot of compliance requirements. The manager of affordable housing has been requesting an audit, Mr. Kinstad, so we accommodated him and we'll put that on there. And just looking at the internal control structure for those various grants that they're in charge of. The next one is Public Works, storm, sewer, and drainage. We've never done an audit of this area of Public Works. There's a lot of revenue that comes in off that storm sewer fee that shows up on your property tax bill. It brings in over $5 million in annual revenue. The purpose of that storm, sewer, and drainage is just to carry that storm runoff, make sure it gets into the Big Sioux River, and make sure it's not there's EPA requirements with that as well. So we're going to look at that, and that'll be a brand new audit. Next one is the, again, Public Works fuel control audit. We did an audit back in 2011, 3 years ago. We had several recommendations. We looked at those fuel cards that are issued to employees. At that time, the database was really needed to be cleaned up a lot. A lot of cards were on there that hadn't been used since 2007. They were still out there. So we're going to make sure that those audit recommendations were implemented that we recommended 3 years ago. And we spend a lot of money on fuel, whether between the the police cars and Public Works and all the other vehicles. It's a lot of money what we spend on that. So. And also, the finance director had asked me in the survey, he said, could you also look at the payback from the agencies that use our fueling sites? We have 3 fueling sites around the city. So the county employees fuel up there, and the school district employees, apparently. So we get paid back from them, so he wanted to make sure that we're billing them and getting the remits correctly from other agencies that use the fueling pumps. So that's why that's on there. Great Plains Zoo and Museum. We have a number of contracts with people to manage city facilities. That's one of them. The city owns the zoo and the museum. We hire somebody to run it. The finance director recommended we look at internal controls there. I agree. So we'll do the zoo this year, and maybe next year we could do the pavilion, et cetera, kind of make the rounds of those various agencies that manage facilities for us. Consultations. We had a request from the health department with a new ambulance contract that will be implemented next year, switching from Rural Metro to Paramedics Plus. You know all about that. If you're on the council, you were asked to approve that contract. So they had requested help. How are we going to make sure that the provider is doing what they're supposed to be doing? They need help. They want a consultation. We're happy to do that. The one thing is we want to make sure is that we're not assuming a management role. Under audit standards, we're not allowed to do that, but we can certainly discuss it and help them with that. So,
Can I ask a question here?
yes.
Are we going to wait until after May to do this one, or when will that?
Yeah, in fact, I just had a phone call from Julie Charbonneau, the REMSA quality control person. She said, we probably won't have something, I think, in writing until maybe April. So she just said, for audit planning purposes, just keep that in mind. And I said, well, I'll certainly read the RFP, because it's quite detailed. And she said, yeah, read the RFP, and then we'll kind of have to wait until we have something nailed down, and then we'll, okay, now how are we going to monitor the performance?
So the contract has not come before the council yet.
Yeah. She in fact, yeah, she had, when I got back from lunch, she had a message on my machine, and that's what it was. She just said, for audit planning, just make sure that we, that you're aware of that, that it is finalized yet, so. The next two projects were analysis. This came from Public Works. They'd requested this. So we're going to treat this as an analysis more than an audit. There's a number of energy-saving projects the city has implemented or will be in 2015. For example, changing out the traffic signals with LED bulbs. That was done in the last 5 years or so. And also in 2015, they're going to now put some of those LED lights in the street lights in the 5 test areas. And they'll be doing some analysis of that, and we'll be kind of seeing what they're doing and just maybe to see if it's if there's a payback on that. Another thing Public Works was doing with the street lights is trying to do some sort of survey of residents to see if they like the lights or if they have complaints about them. And so we'll be looking at that. And also the adaptive traffic control, in 2014 on 26th Street, they put in the adaptive traffic control, and next year they'll be doing it on Minnesota from 18th to the interstate, trying to see if that really is relieving the congestion. That's a major priority for Public Works, is reducing traffic congestion, so that's important. Again, other activities, that's kind of boilerplate that we put in there, technical assistance, special request, audits, the fraud hotline, top of page 5, the follow up on audit recommendations, and just some ongoing auditing activities. Some anti-fraud things that we can do, testing, doing a sample count of sensitive assets, make sure they're there. That sort of thing. Trying to use more data extraction software, and I'll be talking about that in a moment when I talk about what I learned from my trip down to Overland Park last week about data analysis. So, and then we have to get continuing ed. Kim and I have professional certifications. We have to get so many hours each year, and so that's part of our activity with the Internal Audit Office. So I would request your support of that. I know, Councilor Rolfing, we talked a couple of days ago, you might want to add something to the plan?
Yeah, I'll look at that later.
Okay, we'll look at that later. Okay.
Any questions for Rich? I have one, just a comment, I guess, the follow-up on status of audit recommendations. That seems to me to be a very important part of the annual process that you guys do.
Yeah.
To make sure that when we do make recommendations that they're followed up on, and that, or if there are some there's some give and take, maybe not some agreement on it, that we come to a conclusion and make sure that they are. I think that's a very, very important part of the audit.
And that's required by audit standards. We have to do that. And certainly if there was something very serious that we felt wasn't being addressed, then what we would have to do is come to the audit committee and say, we need to resolve this. Somebody's got to take responsibility. We think it's a big deal, management doesn't. We haven't had very many situations like that where we thought there was a high risk that wasn't being addressed by management. But certainly audit committee, I guess, would be you'd be the jury. Yeah, you decide, okay, we let management accept the risk, and we go from there, or whatever. So
I would entertain a motion to accept this report.
So, second?
And any other comments? All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
okay, so that'll be on the council agenda for next Tuesday night. So to officially approve that. So.
Yep.
You want me to do the?
Next one is the, annual annual report.
Yeah, you should have a hard copy there, and it's also on the SIRE system. I think the two big things I think you should already know about, Kim achieved her certification as Certified Internal Auditor in July or August. A big deal there. So that's on bottom of page 2 there. You'll see CIA behind Kim's name. That's what it means. And of course, the other one was on page page 5 there, at the very, very last sentence of the report, we had the peer review, and we passed. We're excited about that, but we talked about that in some depth last time. So those are the two big things. As far as completing the audit plan, on page 4, I listed all the things that were on the 2014 plan. We got through everything. The 3 that you'll see at our next meeting, the first meeting of next year, probably February, more than likely. Dakota Golf, Kim's working on that. That'll wrap up soon. Rental registration, we had the exit meeting on Tuesday. Jess was working on that, so that's just kind of in the, waiting for a response from management phase. And then I worked on that Mid-America natural gas energy. I just have to wrap up the work papers, and so that's pretty much, we've got everything accomplished. The one thing that's going to kind of straggle on is that construction contract audit. Started it last year. I picked the 41st Street, and that's wrapped up. And then the downtown, the 2nd Avenue intersection there by the old Midland building. But another one was the new fire station. That won't be completed until the spring, so I won't officially wrap up the audit until spring. So that's just kind of ongoing. But so, for the most part, we got through the annual audit plan. We didn't have any special requests in 2014. Usually we've had one special request each year, but we didn't have any in 2014. But we try to accommodate that if possible. Based on the audits we completed, we had 10 audit recommendations. Audit clients concurred with all. But like I said, we do have to follow up, because just because they concur doesn't mean necessarily that it got implemented. So we do follow up and report that. And then occasionally on the audit plan, like you see with the fuel control, that we actually don't just rely upon management self-reporting, that we actually go take a look. And that's, like you said, it's important, and it's also required by audit standards. It's part of the deal. You have to follow up. So,
Questions for Rich? Yes, Christine?
I have a question, and
Counselor Erickson.
me being newer, I guess my question to the auditors, I know a lot of your audits are about the accountability and things of that sort. Is part of your scope also cost savings of why do you do it that way? You could
yeah,
some dollars.
we're allowed to do that, and occasionally we'll have an idea that we think would save some money. It's probably not the number one focus. Probably is controls.
Controls.
But certainly our audit charter is very broad, what we can look at. So,
right.
If we notice something or something occurs to us, we can ask management, have you thought about this? And sometimes they say, yeah, we have. It just, maybe it won't work in our situation. Or sometimes we make recommendations to spend money, but we think that there's a good reason to do that. Like when we did the RFP for ambulance service, we did recommend hiring a consultant, and I think that was around $95,000 to hire Fitch and Associates. But we thought it was money well spent. So sometimes the audit will recommend that we do spend money, and I think the council had to do a supplemental appropriation in 2013, I think before you were on the council. So it can go both ways, where we might recommend, we think this would save money. In other cases, we say, we think we should spend a little more money, but we think it would be worth it because it would address significant risk or provide a benefit to the city. So.
Kim, did you have something to add?
Yeah, on that same note, I mean, it's not always a financial matter either. I think she's alluding to the fact that we do in all our audits and procedures look for efficiencies, in procedures and processes throughout the city, so we do give advice there as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Entertain a motion to accept this report.
So moved.
Second Kylie. All in favor, aye? Aye. Motion carries. Thank you, Rich and Kim. Last, or not last, but next on reports and updates is your update of the party you went to down in Kansas City. No, of the continuing education.
Yes. This is something organized by the federal auditors. I think the GAO organizes these regional forums every year. I think one reason, number one, is they have to get so many hours of continuing ed in specifically related to government, and this is kind of a low-cost way to do it. So it tends to be, it's federal, state, and local auditors are invited. It tends to be a little heavy on the federal side because of that. But so last week, I've been to this, I think, 4 or 5 times down in Overland Park. Kansas. And this year, it wasn't just the Mid-America. They actually had the Southeast region and the Southwest region. So they had a little bit more folks than usual. I think they had over 100 auditors there in the room. And each year, we usually have a keynote address by a state auditor. A few years ago, it was the Missouri State Auditor. Last year, it was Nebraska State Auditor. This year, it was the Mississippi State Auditor, Mr. Pickering. And those are always very interesting because they're elected officials, and they're usually excellent speakers. So that's always fun. But we had it was 12 hours of CPE. It was all day Thursday and then half a day on Friday. We talked about risk assessments and how to do them better, auditing standards updates, something called the Green Book. We had to pass a Red Book peer review. We have to comply with the Red Book, and Ide Bailey has to comply with the Yellow Book when they audit the grants. Something called the Green Book, which I wasn't really familiar with, and I found out it's the standards of the internal control for federal agencies, is what the Green Book is. And you can download it from the GAO website, which I did. And they said that they just made a major revision in September to that. And anybody who receives federal money, which would be the City of Sioux Falls, is not required to comply with the Green Book, but strongly recommended that they comply with the Green Book. So when we do that affordable housing audit, that'll be sort of our audit criteria that we're, okay, this is what you guys should be doing according to this Green Book to have this internal control structure for receiving federal money. And it's all about, efficiencies and preventing fraud, waste, and abuse. And so that was something they talked about for about an hour. And they also talked about the Yellow Book and the Red Book too a little bit. So that was new to me. Did have about 3 hours on fraud detection, how to tell if somebody's lying. We had a professor from Kansas, University of Kansas, who was a forensic accountant for many years, and now he's a professor at KU. He had a lot of information about when you're talking to people, what the body language indicates about deception, so it could be useful for auditing. And then we had another forensic accountant who's in private practice in Chicago, Mr. Green, and he had a lot of very interesting real-life cases. He's been doing this since 1986 with his firm, Green and Associates, and so that was very interesting. Some things that we can do as far as our ongoing auditing activities. For example, one thing he says, look at your payroll, take your entire payroll, sort it by, look at gross to net, and you look at, say, percentage of net to gross, for example, and then you sort it, highest to lowest. He said if you find some payroll where the gross equals the net, or it's very, very close, he said that could be a ghost employee, because they don't have any deductions taken out. And then he says those way at the bottom where they're only getting about 10% of their gross, what are they living on? He said it could be a fraudster, that they know they got to pay taxes on their ill-gotten gains, so they have an enormous amount withheld. So he said that's one thing that he uses in his work, and he says it's based on his practical experience. He said it's something we can do. It may not turn up anything, but it's something we could do on a regular basis. And with, I think, from some help from IT, I think we can do that pretty easily. And he had some other suggestions, too, about fraud detection. And super. Yeah, so did talk about data analytics. That's the big buzzword now, is using data analytics, such as that sorting test, getting auditors to be more efficient with data analytics. You talked about big data, especially in federal auditing. There's so much data out there, and how can you mine that and look at that and use that in audit work. And then they just started a pilot program last year, and they talked about this. They said the state, federal, and local government auditors need to have a lot more cooperation and maybe even do some joint audits together. And they said, I gave an example from Denver, the city and county of Denver. The local auditors were doing an audit of overtime in the sheriff's office. Little did they know that down the hall, some federal auditors were looking at the same stuff. And they had no idea until months later. And they said, so they came up with this pilot program, and they tried it last year with, I think, in Portland and in Denver on affordable housing, kind of having the state, the feds, and the local government kind of do a joint audit. And lessons learned, things that have to be worked out. But that'll probably be a trend going into the future, more communication among the 3 levels of auditing. So I thought that was very interesting. So, worth it, learned some new stuff. They did talk about that GASB 68, which Brian and Dean were talking about, that whole thing with the pension liabilities. That's what's caused certain cities to go bankrupt. Not the only reason, but certainly with Detroit just coming out of bankruptcy, Stockton, California, a number of other cities, pension liabilities can be huge. And now they're going to have to be on the balance sheets or statement of position rather than just being a footnote on page 75 of the 100-page report going forward now. So for a few cities, it could be huge.
Yes.
I don't think it will be for us. Like he said, with the ones that are on the state system, they have to get that information from the state. The state's going to have to give them that information. You know, you might have 100 municipalities, and the state's going to have to tell the city, okay, this is your share of the liability, or this. Now ours would be a little more complicated because we have two systems now. So, but yeah, we will see that next year with the city. So,
Super.
yeah.
Thank you. That sounds like you had a good meeting.
Yep.
Learned a lot, and, you know, I always said when I go to those things during my time, that if you come away with one thing, just one thing, it's usually worth it, very much so.
Yeah.
Because it'll help somebody else along the way, and it sounds like you came up with more than that.
Yep.
Then, Kim, you want to tell us about this brochure that you put out here?
Yeah.
And, you know,
I made copies of it.
Hey, so the party in San Diego
The
this
party in
year.
San Diego.
yeah,
I'm
the
gonna say
party
your
in San
chances of
Diego.
going are probably
surfing.
better without the brochure.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, but,
I think it says provided by Rich on the
We-
So this will be the same training I went to last year,
different
run
location.
by Elga.
We'd like to send her to the pre-conference workshop. That's on peer review, right? That'll be on Sunday.
If I get that training, then I could be available to do peer reviews like Rich had would
Yeah.
and provided his.
It's like an 8-hour, and the official conference starts on Monday and goes till Tuesday, but they have this 8-hour workshop on Sunday, just how to do a peer review, so.
At the surfing workshop?
I heard it might be on the beach.
that sounds good. Yeah,
I mean, I think if you sign up before February 15th, you save $100, so we didn't know if we'd have an audit committee in February by the 15th, so that's why we put it on the agenda to
Yep.
get it.
and that should be fine.
Move to approve.
Okay.
Second? Any discussion? No? All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. I'd say learn a lot, have a little bit of fun. Okay, any open discussion for the audit committee?
Just have one thing.
You have one thing?
Yeah, one of the managers asked if we could put information on when the results are all, audit reports done, if we could, especially for stuff that would affect a lot of employees, if there's some way we could communicate that. I don't know if we put it on the intranet. He was talking about the cell phone audit that we did, and then we had a couple recommendations on that.
You know, one of our trainings that we attended to also suggested doing like a quarterly, just a newsletter out to staff, so we could do it that way, or
Yeah,
put it on Insight.
Yeah, because you said, as a manager, he wouldn't necessarily know we'd done an audit on cell phones, and I think we came up with a recommendation on using the right form when an employee leaves or something, and
Yeah,
For-
turn it
for the
back in or
exiting,
whatever,
right,
yeah.
the exiting checklist, and people were using one they'd saved on their hard drive instead of going to,
To HR to get that.
yeah. So that may be something we pursue. I know some audit shops will do that. They might do some sort of newsletter to folks, reminding them of certain things.
Internal audit.
Something that would apply to many employees, I guess, and, yeah.
And
so.
it never hurts to remind them we're here.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
We'll get more ideas.
Yeah, you might get more ideas if they know, or, sometimes you don't come around every year, so they may not know who you are or what you do, so
That would make sense. I would encourage that.
we'll pursue that, so.
Anything else? Well, not hearing anything else, I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you.